My name is Kaylee Johnson. I was 31 years old and my mom had just set the last casserole dish on my parents' dining room table in Rochester when my dad made his announcement. The nice china was out, the candles were lit, and my older sister Jordan was already sipping wine like this was some celebration instead of an ambush. My dad cleared his throat, folded his hands, and said almost casually, "After dinner, we'll go over the papers so you can sign your studio over to your sister. It just makes sense, Kaylee." My fork slipped against the plate loud enough that everyone looked up. I blinked at him then, at the stack of manila folders by his elbow. "No," I said. The word landed harder than the fork. "If you were sitting at that table instead of me, what would you have done? Would you have gone along to keep the peace or drawn a line right there between the mashed potatoes and the guilt trips? As you listen, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you think you'd say to parents like mine, because that night showed me exactly how far some families will go when they think they own you. Growing up, Jordan was the hurricane, and I was the one sweeping up after the storm, and everyone treated that like the natural order of things. When we were kids, she'd leave glitter and nail polish all over the bathroom, and I'd scrub the counters before our parents came home more afraid of their disappointment than her mess. If Jordan broke something, it somehow became my fault for not watching your sister. When I patched her posters back onto the wall or glued a broken frame, she'd laugh and call me maintenance girl like it was a joke I was supposed to enjoy. By the time I was 12, I had quietly accepted that my job in the family was to make chaos disappear without asking for thanks. High school only sharpened that script. Jordan got to quit her part-time job after 2 weeks because she needed to focus on cheer, while I was told my grocery store hours were good for building character. When her car mysteriously got dinged in a parking lot, my dad co-signed a nicer used SUV before the month was over. When my bike chain snapped, he shrugged and said, "You're old enough to walk? Or fix it yourself?" My mom loved to say, half joking, "If I'd had you first, Kaylee, I might not have had another. You're too independent." It sounded like a compliment until I realized it meant they assumed I could do without help, while Jordan simply deserved it. The only person who ever seemed to see me as more than backup staff was my grandma, my mom's mother, Florence Bishop. She lived in a tiny brick house not far from Lake Ontario, with a backyard full of mismatched pots and cracked concrete. On summer afternoons, she'd sit with me at her rickety patio table tracing the lines where old cement had broken and been patched. "You're like that," she'd tell me, squinting over her iced tea. "You don't look flashy like your sister, but you hold things together." When she died my second year out of college, the grief hit like a delayed wave. At the reading of her will, Jordan got a tidy startup gift in cash, and I got a stack of spiral notebooks tied with twine that everyone called Grandma's doodles. They smiled and said it suited me, the practical one. Those doodles turned out to be pages of notes and sketches about small businesses my grandma had worked for, lists of suppliers, cost breakdowns, and ideas she'd never been brave enough to try. There were descriptions of neighborhood laundromats and bakeries, little details about which corners got the best foot traffic in Rochester winters. Tucked in the back was a rough plan for turning an old laundromat into a combined print studio and coffee bar. I read that page so many times the paper softened at the creases. One freezing January, I walked past a boarded-up laundromat on a side street near downtown and realized it matched one of Grandma's notes almost exactly. The landlord thought I was crazy, but offered a cheap lease if I handled all the repairs myself. I signed it with shaking hands. For the next 3 years, every paycheck and every free weekend went into that tired building. I stripped linoleum until my knees ached, scraped soap scum off ancient tile, and watched YouTube videos about refinishing concrete while paint dust turned my hair gray at the edges. I bought a used espresso machine and an old letterpress from a closing print shop, teaching myself to repair them with the same stubbornness I once used on Jordan's broken things. I named the place the Washline Press because the pipes and exposed ducts still reminded me of laundry days. The first time the neon sign flickered on over the door, I stood on the sidewalk in the cold breath, fogging the glass, and felt like I'd finally built something that belonged entirely to me. My parents came by once early on, right before the grand opening, mostly because my mom didn't want to be embarrassed if neighbors asked about Kaylee's project. My dad took one slow lap around the unfinished counter, looked at the paint cans stacked in the corner, and said, "This is a lot of work for a coffee shop that might not last a year." My mom wrinkled her nose at the exposed brick, saying how Jordan's dream yoga studio smelled like eucalyptus and candles instead of burnt espresso. I handed them lattes I'd practiced 100 times. My dad let his go cold. My mom took two polite sips and set it down. When they left, I watched them pull away through the front window, tired and dusty but weirdly calm. The space echoed behind me, but it was my echo, not theirs. The business grew slowly, then steadily. Freelancers started camping out at the big communal table, ordering drip coffee while they designed wedding invitations. College kids booked time on the letterpress for class projects. I lived frugally, paid down my loans, and moved the old notebooks to a shelf behind the counter where I could see Grandma's handwriting whenever I looked up invoices. One spring, when things finally felt stable, I went to the bank to ask about refinancing a small personal loan I'd taken during the build-out. That's when I saw the records from the education trust my parents had set up in my name, years earlier, emptied out around the same time Jordan's yoga studio opened in the suburbs, and my parents remodeled their kitchen. The dates lined up like a bad punchline. I didn't confront them right away, partly because I knew exactly how that script would go. Accusations of ingratitude, reminders about all we've done for you, and some story about how the money had always been meant for the family as a whole. Instead, I filed the information away like another receipt and kept working. Jordan's studio, meanwhile, became a black hole of free rent and endless Instagram photos. Every time a new piece of equipment showed up in her stories, I wondered which line item in my trust had paid for it. By the time my parents invited me to that Sunday dinner, their voices bright and brittle on the phone, I had a sinking feeling it wasn't just about catching up. My parents' house smelled like pot roast and lemon cleaner when I walked in that night, the one that started this whole mess. Jordan was already there, all blowout hair and fresh manicure, leaning into her fiancé, Tyler Grant, as if the chair needed her weight to stay upright. My mom fluttered around the table, making sure Jordan's favorite rolls were warm, then set a plate in front of me with a practiced smile. We made small talk about weather and road construction until my dad brought out that stack of folders and laid them on the table like a centerpiece. So he said, "Your mother and I have been talking. Jordan's studio is going through a rough patch, and your business is more established. The simplest thing is for you to transfer the wash line press into her name. She's better suited to run it long term." The room went strangely quiet, even though the clock on the wall kept ticking. Tyler's eyes flicked from my dad to me, as if he'd walked into a meeting with the agenda hidden. My mom jumped in quickly, voice syrupy. "You're so resourceful, Kaylee. You could start something new anywhere. Jordan needs the stability, especially with the wedding coming up." I set my fork down carefully, the plate clinking a little too loud. "No," I said. My dad's smile flattened. "This isn't a request," he replied. "We put money into that place. You'll sign it over to your sister. It's what's best for the family." Jordan didn't say thank you or I'm sorry. She just looked at me like I was being slow to understand. I finished my meal in small mechanical bites, more to buy time than because I was hungry. After dessert, my mom tried to herd me into the living room to go over the paperwork, but I grabbed my coat instead. My dad followed me to the doorway, voice low. "Don't do something you'll regret, Kaylee. You know what you owe us." The old me, the kid fixing broken frames before they noticed, would have folded. This version of me stepped onto the porch, looked back once and said, "I don't owe you my life's work." The air outside was sharp and cold, the kind that cleared your head faster than coffee. By the time I reached my car, I knew I wasn't going to argue with them. I was going to get a lawyer. A regular at the shop recommended Danielle Pierce, a small business attorney whose office sat above a law firm downtown, the stairs creaking under each step like they were sorting out who deserved to climb them. Her conference room smelled like paper and burnt coffee, neutral and tired, the opposite of my parents' staged dining room. I spread my folders on the table, my lease, the equipment receipts, bank statements showing every transfer I'd made, and copies of Grandma's trust paperwork with my name on the original account. Danielle read in silence for several minutes, her pen tapping a soft rhythm. Then she let out a short, incredulous laugh. "They're threatening to sue you for a studio you pay for, manage, and own on paper," she said. "And they diverted money from a trust in your name to your sister's business and their own house. That's not family drama. That's breach of fiduciary duty." Hearing someone else call it that, something legal and specific instead of just how my family is, was like having a window opened in a stuffy room. Danielle leaned forward, flipping through the trust statements. "They were trustees on this account." I nodded. "And you never authorized these withdrawals?" Another nod. She sat back, eyes sharpening. "Then, here's what we do. We document every dollar you put into the wash line press. We confirm how much left that trust and where it went. When they file against you, we counter with claims for conversion, misappropriation, and depending on their taxes, maybe fraud." For the first time since that dinner, my chest loosened. Someone was finally looking at the same puzzle I'd been staring at for years and calling the picture what it was. That night, my apartment turned into a paper war room. I scanned contracts and labeled digital folders: lease equipment, build-out costs, payroll, trust statements. I printed copies and slid them into color-coded binders I bought from the office supply store down the street, each tab handwritten. At the shop, between pouring lattes and ringing up customers, I forwarded bank emails to Danielle and saved screenshots of old texts where my parents had bragged about helping Jordan follow her dreams right after withdrawals from the trust. I recorded a new call with my dad, where he insisted they had put everything into your business despite the paperwork showing otherwise, then saved the file under threats. Audio. Every label, every hole punch, every click of the binder rings made me feel a little less like their child and a little more like my own advocate. It didn't take long for the other shoe to drop. A certified letter arrived at the shop one Tuesday, dropped on the counter with the mail, the envelope thick and official. My hands hardly shook as I opened it and read that my parents, Marilyn and Leonard Johnson, were suing me, claiming a beneficial interest in the wash line press and seeking to force a transfer of ownership to Jordan. I called Danielle, and her voice was steady. "We expected this," she said. "I'll file our response and counterclaims. In the meantime, keep everything organized and don't talk to them without me." A week later, she emailed copies of the countersuit demands for repayment of the trust fund's damages for misuse and a request for their business and personal tax records. Seeing my parents' names on legal documents as defendants was surreal, but honest. The next few weeks blurred into a strange routine. By day, I brewed coffee, trained a new barista, and joked with regulars about Rochester winters. By night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by binders, highlighters, and sticky notes, cross-referencing bank statements with invoices. Danielle and her paralegal Cameron Ross sent updates. Subpoenas served, responses received, excuses attempted. There were hints in my parents' filings that they had borrowed from my trust for joint family ventures, code words my grandmother had never used. My phone lit up with messages from aunts and cousins. "You're really going to drag your parents to court over money? This isn't how family works." I didn't argue. I saved the texts in a folder labeled Noise and turned my phone face down while I worked. Somewhere in the middle of all this, I noticed my reflection in the dark cafe window one night after closing. Same face, same messy bun, but my shoulders were straighter, my jaw calmer. I wasn't waiting for my dad to come to his senses or my mom to finally say, "I'm proud of you." I had stopped asking for approval and started demanding accountability instead. When Danielle called one evening to say, "They're rattled. They're trying to settle quietly and keep this out of any official complaints," I was wiping down the espresso machine. "Not yet," I told her. "They still think this is a tantrum I'll back down from." They need to understand this is not negotiable. She paused, then said, All right. They invited you to another family dinner to talk it out, didn't they? Of course they had. The second dinner at my parents' house looked a lot like the first, but the energy was completely different for me. The dining room smelled like polish and pot roast again. The good dishes were back, and there was an empty chair at the far end for Kaylee, as my mom put it, as if I were some honored guest. Only this time, I didn't walk in alone. Danielle stepped in beside me, her briefcase in hand, and Cameron followed with a slim leather folder. My mom's mascaraed eyes widened, then started to glisten. You brought your lawyer? She asked, voice wobbling. I brought the truth, I said, taking my seat. Jordan sat next to Tyler, her hand already wrapped around his, her expression a mix of annoyance and disbelief. My dad tried to start on a familiar note. Let's not make this adversarial, he said, gesturing at the roast. We're all family here. We can fix this if you just agree to transfer the business. Jordan's willing to compensate you for some of what you've put in. Danielle reached into her bag, pulled out a folder, and slid it in front of him. Before we talk about what Kaylee should give up, she said evenly, we need to review what was taken from her. The sound of the folder hitting the wood cut through the room. Inside were copies of trust statements, bank transfers, and highlighted notations. These show funds leaving a trust in Kaylee's name and landing in your joint account, your home equity line, and Jordan Johnson Yoga LLC, she continued. There is no documentation of Kaylee's consent. My mom's hand shook as she reached for her wine glass, the liquid trembling. Jordan let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. You're really going to nitpick family help like this? She snapped. You never even used that money. Dad just made it work for all of us. I looked at her for the first time that evening. That help was my college fund, I said. Grandma's gift. It turned into your studio and a new granite countertop for Mom. And then, you all tried to take the one thing I built with my own hands and put your name on it. Cameron slid another page across the table, a simple chart of dates and transfers, each arrow pointing from my trust to my parents' accounts, and from there to checks written to Jordan's landlord and contractor. Tyler, who'd been quiet until then, leaned forward to read. His face drained of color as he followed the arrows. Is this true? He asked Jordan, his voice low. She shifted in her chair. It's not like that, she said. My parents helped both of us. Kaylee's just being dramatic. Danielle didn't raise her voice. We have bank verification, Mr. Grant, she said. And their own sworn statements about acting as trustees. They used assets held for your fiancé's future to fund your fiancé's sister and their own renovations, then tried to coerce her into signing over her separate business. If we move forward, this won't just be a civil dispute. It may involve the state attorney general and the IRS. The words landed with a quiet finality that smelled more like courtrooms than Sunday dinners. My dad's face went from red to gray. You're bluffing, he said, but his eyes stayed on the spreadsheet. Danielle shook her head slightly. We've already drafted the complaints, she replied. What we're offering tonight is an option. You drop your lawsuit against Kaylee. You sign a written acknowledgement that the Washline Press is entirely hers, with no beneficial interest for you or Jordan. You agree to a repayment schedule for the trust funds with reasonable interest. You file amended tax returns reflecting the mischaracterized funds. If you do all of that within the timelines we outline, we keep this civil and contained. If not, we file everything and let the agencies do their jobs. My mom started to cry in earnest, loud, messy sobs about family tearing itself apart. Across from me, Tyler slowly slid his chair back. He took off his engagement ring, Jordan's ring, and set it gently on the table. The little click it made against the wood cut through my mother's wailing. You knew about this? He asked Jordan. She stared at the ring, then at me, then at the pile of documents. I knew they helped me, she said weakly. I didn't know the details. It sounded like a half-truth at best. Tyler shook his head. You were okay taking your sister's future and then trying to take her business too, he said. If this is how your family treats each other, I don't want to marry into it." He stood up, nodded once to me, and walked out, leaving his untouched plate and the ring behind. No one chased him. My dad stared at the papers like sheer will could make the ink rearrange itself. My mom muttered something about outsiders who don't understand, even though it was her own granddaughter's money she'd helped siphon. Jordan's eyes were wet, but she still managed to glare at me as if I'd lit the match instead of exposing the fire. I stood up my chair, scraping the floor softly. "This isn't revenge," I said, my voice steady. "This is me refusing to let you rewrite what you did. I won't be giving you my studio, my trust, or any more chances. You can sign Danielle's proposal, or you can explain yourselves to people who don't care that we share a last name." Then I turned to leave. On my way out, I heard my dad call my name loud enough for the neighbors to maybe notice the same clipped tone he'd used when I was 8 and hadn't cleaned something fast enough. For the first time, I didn't stop or turn around. The night outside was cold and clear, the porch light buzzing above me. My keys jingled in my hand, solid and familiar. As I walked down their front steps, each footfall felt like punctuation at the end of a very long sentence I hadn't written, but was finally choosing how to end. Danielle and Cameron followed quietly, their briefcases clicking shut like book covers. We got into our separate cars and drove away from the house where I'd grown up and been slowly erased. 6 months later, the wash line press still smelled like coffee and ink, not fear. The lawsuit against me was dismissed with prejudice after my parents signed the agreement Danielle drafted. A civil judgment locked in the repayment schedule for the trust funds. They had to sell a rental property and refinance their own home to start making the payments. Danielle forwarded notice that amended tax returns had been filed, the kind that often leads to audits and extra questions. Jordan's yoga studio closed temporarily and then quietly for good when the lease wasn't renewed. From what little filtered through distant relatives before I blocked them, my parents were keeping a low profile now that some of their friends knew the broad strokes of what had happened. I, on the other hand, started my mornings by unlocking the shop, flipping on the neon sign, and watching my breath fog the glass for a second before the warm air took over. The mail still brought official envelopes, sometimes payment confirmations from my parents' attorney notices about the trust account slowly refilling in my name, but they didn't make my stomach drop anymore. One rainy afternoon, Danielle stopped by in jeans instead of a blazer, ordered a latte, and handed me a thin envelope. "Final paperwork," she said. "Everything related to their claims on the studio is closed." I didn't open it right away. The knowledge was enough. We sat in comfortable silence, listening to the hum of the espresso machine and the patter of rain against the window. I haven't spoken to my parents or to Jordan since that dinner. There were a few last-ditch texts early on, some angry, some dripping with guilt and Bible verses, but I muted them, then blocked the numbers. I don't scroll their social media, and I don't ask about them when I run into people from our old neighborhood. Cutting them off wasn't easy. It felt like amputating a limb that had been infected for years. But once the pain faded, I realized how much clearer everything else became. The studio, my friendships, even the quiet moments alone on my couch, all felt less crowded without their invisible expectations pressing on my chest. Do I understand why they did what they did? In some ways, yes. They were scared of losing control, scared of Jordan failing, scared of facing their own choices about money and favoritism. But understanding isn't the same as forgiving, and it definitely isn't a reason to hand them another chance to hurt me. I won't be going back for holidays or letting them meet some future partner or quietly slipping them money just this once. The line is drawn, and it's permanent. If your family ever expects you to sacrifice your entire life's work just to keep their secrets intact, I hope you remember this love without respect is just control in nicer clothes. So that's what happened at dinner at my parents' house and everything that came after. I walked in as the maintenance girl they thought they could still manage, and walked out as the owner of my own story, my own business, and my own boundaries. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your life in it, please don't wait for people like that to suddenly change. Protect your future before they spend it for you. Thanks for staying with me to the end of this and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you honestly do if your parents tried to take everything you built and hand it to someone else?